Okay, NFLPA contract advisors, that's your fancy name for agent. According to rules, they have to have at least a secondary degree. I'm not as familiar with the NBA Players Association, I'm not as familiar with Major League Baseball, but I think the NFL has the most extensive requirements for being an agent. Now, all of y'all will satisfy that because you're going through law school. But not everybody's got that. But you have to have at least a master's to be an agent. There's a lot of things that are said of the NFLPA that are criticisms. Quite frankly, a lot of them are valid, but that's not one of them. Everyone that's coming in there is a pretty highly educated individual. And so I think that you can say that is certainly a positive thing. They don't all have to be lawyers, although about 80% are. There are people that come from different walks of life. Some made money in real estate. Some are engineers. Some have banking backgrounds. There's a lot of different avenues that they come from. Being an attorney certainly is a beneficial thing because there's so many legal matters associated with being an agent, and I know that every contract advisor that I know that is a lawyer, that's a big part of their pitch, is that they can handle all those matters. So that's something that if y'all decide to go down that road will be a big advantage for y'all too. Of course, understanding the fact that there are a lot of lawyers out there, but it's something that's, that you'll certainly be a check in your box. What kind of law do they practice? That's a common question. Really, almost all kinds of law. What you get, a lot of people, and I didn't include this kind of in print, but a lot of people that come to the industry and come to the business, they're in their 40s, maybe in their early 50s. They've kind of made their money. Maybe they're criminal defense attorneys. Typically, their kids are grown and they're maybe a little bit bored and they want to try something they never have tried before, and they want to kind of do it before they're too old. So they go about it that way. I don't know that there's necessarily a kind of law you need to practice that gives you a leg up on this business. Certainly anything you can do in an entertainment capacity or a sports capacity is going to be beneficial. But I don't think that you're precluded from doing this if you go into any kind of law, corporate law or whatever else. So don't feel like you need to be limited. You don't feel like, oh, I'm going into oil and gas. I just ended my chance of being an agent. That's not true. There are a lot of people that come from non-sexy backgrounds that become successes in this industry, all right? Okay, so a couple more numbers about this. 786 certified agents. When I first launched ITL in 2002, there were about double that number, around 1,500. And I thought, awesome, if I just get all these guys to pay me a little bit of money, I'll do great. And then I think maybe within 2 or 3 years, they put in what was called a 3-year rule, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. And that rule was if you don't get at least one player on a 90-man roster, which is the rosters they have after the draft, those are the super expanded ones. If you don't get at least one guy on a 90-man roster, then in 3 years, then you're out and you got to start over. You got to take the test again. You got to pay the initiation fee again. You got to do the background again, the whole shooting match. And that's knocked a lot of people out because they kind of have that on their horizon and they don't quite know how to ascend that hurdle, and they don't, so they get out or they're pushed out. So there are a number of obstacles now that they used to have. Again, there are a lot of criticism of the NFLPA. I've been one of the ones who's leveled a lot of those criticisms, but that is one that I think you have to say, they've really tried to do a good job of thinning the herd and making only people that are successful and that are good at what they do have any kind of real stamina in the business. So I think that's a plus. Okay, so almost all the agents that are still around have been here less than 10 years. It is a young man's game. You'll hear me say that a lot, young person's game. There are a number of reasons for that, and that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of what we'll talk about today. But the point is, don't feel like you've got to have 30 years in law before you decide to get certified. That's not true at all. There are different considerations that will make it to where you probably don't want to launch right out of law school, but we'll talk about that a little bit further as we go along. And most agents have been certified less than 5 years. I need to throw that in. Okay, so we talked about 3 years. So how do you become an agent? I always say, you want to be an NFL player, be the top 0.5% of the top 0.5% of athletes out there. You want to be a coach, put in 20, 30 years, paying dues, hope you get the right breaks, hope you find the right mentor, hope you get lucky. You want to be an agent, pay $2,500, pass a background check, pass a relatively easy comparably speaking, 3-hour open book exam, and you then pay your money to register and pay your money for your liability insurance, and you're in. You're just as much at the NFL, technically speaking, as Drew Rosenhaus or Tom Condon or any of the other big agents out there, all right? It's a much easier path to the NFL than virtually any other out there. So I think that's part of the draw, as well as the fact that everyone pretty much seen Jerry Maguire. I still haven't. I haven't seen it all the way through, believe it or not. And people look at me like, what? But no, I don't really watch sports movies. I always find them kind of insulting. But anyway, it's an industry that's got a lot of cachet, and it's really sexy and exciting, and people see it from the outside and they think, man, this is awesome. I get to party with players and hang out with them and get autographs whenever I want to, and it seems awesome from the outside. It's not always just like that. But anyway, it is a very, very strong pitch. So you pay your $2,500 in January. Don't tarry on that. If you call them on February 1st, they will no longer accept your registration, which again is an excluding factor that I think the NFLPA is good to do. So you pay your money, they do their background check, they verify that you have the degrees you say you do, and they finish the confirmation process, and that takes usually 2 to 3 months, usually right up until when you take the exam, which is the last weekend in July, the last Friday in July, I should say. They send you materials to study with. I have some supplements on Inside the League that make it a little easier. We have a mock test, and we have some other things, and we do newsletter series that kind of discuss the whole situation, the whole kind of run the gamut of being a new agent and try to help people that way. But anyway, you go to DC and you take the test. You get there on a Wednesday night. You're in class all day Thursday. You're in class Thursday morning. They do kind of a little review, and then you take the test that afternoon. You fly out that evening. So that's kind of a general thing of how it works. Now, typically, you got your results not until maybe late October. Last year they got them, I think, late September, and this year they got them early September. So in the old days, year one started when you passed the exam, and you didn't get any grace or clemency towards that 3 years. But especially in the older days when you weren't getting your results until late October, man, it's hard to get in the race to recruit these players that late when you're getting that late of a start. So your first year was almost gone before you even got started. This year they're doing a better job of getting your results to you sooner, and so you can kind of get in the race and make those rookie mistakes that are part of any business, but are especially part of the agent business. So again, good on the NFLPA for improving that. Okay, so once you get the information that you've passed, you've got till October 1st to, number one, pay $1,200 more for your dues, and then about $1,300 for liability insurance. Now that liability insurance, you may have it already as an attorney. You may have the most awesome liability insurance anyone's ever seen. It doesn't matter. You've got to buy the NFLPA's liability insurance. So that's another $1,300, $1,200. So you're looking at about $5,000 before you've done anything else to start off as an agent. That's your initial investment, but just to satisfy everything the NFLPA asks you to do. All right, so a little bit more about the economics of being an agent. After year one, the dues are $1,200 or $1,700, depending on whether you've got 10 clients or not. It's going to take you a while to get to 10 clients, so for what it's worth, that saves you about $500 for a little while. The state registrations are where you start to get nickel and dimed. Texas requires a I think it's a $10,000 surety bond, or maybe even more, I'm not sure. I know it costs $1,000. Plus they require you to spend money in addition to that for registration. Different states have different rules. Typically they do not let other states' surety bonds count for theirs. So it can really get pricey. Now there are some states that don't have any registration fee whatsoever. Virginia is one. There are a couple in the Northwest that are the same way. So if you want to game plan it and hope that you get players out of there just to save a little money, you can. But typically you're going to spend $500 to $1,000 just getting registered in states. I try not to get my clients to spend more than $500 to $1,000, I should say. You may spend more. It kind of depends on what you want to do and how far your reach is going to be based on what you plan on. But usually you don't have to do that right out of the boat. You can kind of decide where you're going to go and who you want to talk to and where your best possibilities are before you decide where you're going to spend your money. And I highly recommend that people do that, because as we'll continue to discuss, the money adds up quickly in this industry. All right. Training fees. are optional. I don't know if anyone even knows what I'm talking about when I talk about training fees. This is what players are doing from January through the end of February, sometimes into March, where they're preparing for the drills that have become such a big part of the pre-draft process, running the 40-yard dash, vertical jump, broad jump, reps, benching 225 pounds as many times as you can, running the 3-cone drill, running the short shuttle, running the long shuttle if you're a wide receiver or defensive back. So that has become a pretty big deal, and it's become a pretty expensive part of it, and kind of a gateway item. You can sometimes find someone who's local, who's trustworthy, and that your client won't mind training with for, relatively speaking, pennies. But every year there's someone that comes to me, every year, guys, and says, man, you come to me in May, after the draft, maybe June, and they'll say, man, I sure wish I'd gotten with you sooner. We spent $25,000 training a guy, and he's on the street now. He's not on a roster. It's hard to recover from those kinds of mistakes, guys. And that's where Inside the League really comes in, because we kind of try to be stewards of our clients' money. We don't want people to make bad mistakes like that, because quite frankly, you won't be an agent for very long. It's really easy to spin yourself out of this business if you're not careful. Okay, so getting your money back is about 3% on contracts. So that's becoming less common, especially for new agents, because they've got to have something to kind of negotiate with. You're a new agent, you don't have experience, you don't have a client list, you kind of trying to figure this out along the way. Your client may say, I'll do it, but let's do it for 2%, or maybe 1.5%, and sometimes even 0.5%. So that really cuts back on what you can make back and how quickly you can make it back. If you're spending big money on training and a number of other factors, that's a big consideration. Now, the 3% is only if a player makes a roster, and statistically speaking, that's tough to do anyway. So there's just a lot of different variables, a lot of things to think about, and that's why I mention them. Okay. As I discussed, agents cannot assess fees on players until they make the 53-man roster. So there's a 53-man roster, and then there's another 10 players that make it as practice squad players. They're getting $60,000 cut up over 17 weeks with no guarantees from week to week. A team can say, you're gone, with no further obligation. If an NFL player, however, is on the roster opening week, his contract is guaranteed if the agent's good and he makes sure that's put into writing and all those kind of things. Typically that's what happens. But practice squad, not so. So you sign a player, now you train him, now he goes through the process, maybe he gets drafted, maybe he doesn't. Likely chances are, especially as a first-year agent, he does not. Now you've got to try to hustle him onto a roster. We'll talk in more detail about that in a minute. But he has not earned you any money when he makes a roster. He has not earned you any money when he goes through practices. He has not made you any money when he goes to even plays in preseason games. There's only one way he can make money for you, and that's if he makes a 53-man roster. If he makes a practice squad, you cannot assess fees on that. So this is why it's a dicey thing. This is why there's a lot of money up front and a heavy investment for, relatively speaking, pretty high stakes for pretty high risk too. All right, so let's kind of go through the year for an agent. What's it look like? Most of my clients spend spring and summer deciding who they're going to go after. Usually that determination is made based on geography, where they are located. Usually it's got to do with where they've got connections. A lot of people that come into the business, maybe they were a youth coach and they became really close to a player who's highly touted. Maybe they've got a cousin or a nephew or a son who's going to be a big time player. There are a lot of other connections they might have, but in any case, they're going to have to figure out who they're going to go after and what resources they're going to expend to go after them. So they make that determination pretty early on. So you spend summer contacting prospects, and you may go to a school's agent day. Now, an agent day is essentially kind of what it sounds like. You go and you contact the school, let's say it's University of Houston, and you say, okay, I'd like to speak to these 4 seniors. They say, thank you. They make sure that you're registered with the school. And then the contract becomes, okay, they want us, these, maybe all 4, maybe 1, maybe none, want to speak to you. If one of them does, you come to the agent day. But the contract becomes, we will allow you to speak to him at agent day, But we don't want you to talk to him one more time, or any of his affiliates, his parents, anyone related to him, until the season's over. Once the season's over, you can talk to him again. That's kind of a major impediment, because you want to build that relationship with the player. I always compare that to saying, look, when I get to 25, I'm going to meet as many women as I can in a week, and I'm going to make a decision on who I'm going to marry and spend the rest of my life with. It's not quite that drastic, but it's on that order, okay? No one's going to sign with you if they don't know you, and they shouldn't. I mean, isn't that a responsible thing? So I struggle with the way the schools conduct this. I understand that if they ask you to do this and you live by this, it certainly reduces their risks related to their eligibility and also their workload, trying to maintain and find out what's being discussed and all those kinds of things. For that reason, because this is so sensitive, social media is getting monitored by schools more than it ever has been. Some schools like Oklahoma will assign a member of the staff to their better players to do nothing but monitor everything that comes in via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever else. So it's become a very closely watched thing. And that's something that I'm always talking to agents about and going back and forth on is, if I try a front door approach with a school, is it going to preclude me from really having a realistic chance of signing a player? And that's just the sad downside of trying to do things the right way. It's something I grapple with myself as I'm advising these people. Because speaking to a player, speaking to his parents, doing anything of that nature, if you're not providing an inducement, there's nothing illegal about it. You're just exercising free trade. So you may earn brownie points with the school by abiding by their rules, but you also may cut off any chance you have of signing that player. So it's a really delicate balance there. Okay, so fall, recruiting continues. You may actually meet with the parents of a player. You may meet with a player after the game. That happens less than it used to. But I think, especially for newer agents, they find that actually reaching out to the player and getting some response and getting some traction with the player isn't as hard as maybe they thought it was going to be. Because most players are trying to learn about the process themselves, and they don't know you, and they're trying to gather as much as they can, and so it benefits them to have a conversation with you and talk to you and ask questions and learn where you came from and who you are and what you're about and what you do as a day job and all those kinds of things. So you usually can get some traction with players, even if they're big-time players. So that's always encouraging to a point, and we'll get to that point in a minute. So November, visits increase. You're probably in regular contact with a player. Maybe you're in regular contact with an advisor he has. Sometimes that's a Pop Warner coach. Sometimes that's an AAU basketball coach. Sometimes it's any number. Maybe it's an uncle. Maybe it's someone that used to play in the league or feels like they know a lot about the process. And maybe they do or maybe they don't. But anyway, there's a lot of communication going on. And then you're getting into the end of the season for some teams, especially for the D2s, the 1AAs that don't make the playoffs. They're wrapping things up around Thanksgiving. So that's kind of when signing season starts, the low period, or right around Thanksgiving and kind of after that. Another thing that happens that not many people talk about is this is really when the invitation process starts for college all-star games, the games that I've worked on. And those can become mighty competitive. And what a lot of agents come in not understanding is they think, oh, an all-star game is very cut and dried. There's about 100 guys per roster for the games. The top game will take the first 100. The second game takes the second 100. The third game takes the next 100. That's not the case at all. There's a lot of lobbying and push and pull and promoting that take place that get kids to the head of the line through this process, and agents play a major role in that. So they begin to reach out to games on the behalf of players, usually in November, and that continues into December and really kind of reaches a fever pitch in December. So we get to December, signing season is well underway. That's when my job gets really busy. The All-Star invitations start coming out, and you start seeing them online, you start seeing them on Twitter and all those kinds of things, and we track all that. And then the College Bowls begin, usually towards middle to the end of the month. And that becomes a big time for scouts to get out and kind of see a player for the last time. It's also a time that's big time for agents, because if you've got a kid that you feel like you got a good chance of signing, you're going to need to be there right when his game is over, because you don't want to give anyone else a chance to talk them into something that they might not have done otherwise regarding signing a standard representation agreement, also known as an SRA. So December's a really, really busy time of the year for virtually everyone in the industry, but especially for agents. So we get to January. January is where the elite players are signing, because typically the elite players, as y'all probably know, are usually juniors. The really elite players don't make it to their senior year anymore. So they're not declaring until after their season's over. Sometimes they want to kind of weigh things. They want to talk to different people. The schools very often lobby them to stick around, although that's happening less than it used to. So you're seeing a lot of declarations in January and a lot of signings. Also, typically the better players are playing for the better teams, which are playing in later bowls. So it's stretching into January when the major players are signing. So that's January. January is also when training starts for most players, especially the guys that expect to go to the combine. So they're going to start that first full week in January. They'll go all the way through January. They'll go into middle February. And then they'll usually go to the combine the last week of February. It kind of depends on where it falls on the calendar. But it's always starts on a Wednesday, goes Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then it wraps up. So that's the combine. So that's January, that's February. March is for pro days. Y'all probably already know what pro days are, because they've been really popular, and now they're broadcast on ESPN sometime. It's basically when a player goes and he runs through the drills. He runs his 40. He runs 240 times. He does the short shuttle. He does the 3-cone. He does reps if he hasn't done them. He may take the Wonderlic if he hasn't already. He may interview with scouts if he hasn't already. He'll do a lot of things where he'll get vetted and checked out and looked at. April is when things begin to kind of start to whittle down, and pro days are continuing usually early in the month, but they're wrapping up. Teams begin to bring players in. They get, I think, 25 slots to bring players in for in-person visits. These are usually mainly just interviews, but they sometimes involve a workout as well. And only so many players can do that. Also, the Super Regional takes place in April, which is the final kind of crowning event of the NFL Regional Combines. We'll talk a little bit more about them a little later, but essentially those are pay combines for players. You don't have to really meet any criteria per se. You just have to be able to pay your, I think, $275. Then you get to go through a genuine combine experience with former NFL scouts. They compile all the information, put it into a database, and they ask NFL teams to review it. Some look at it more than others do, but it's really primarily, truth be told, a revenue source for the NFL, and it's become a very popular one. Okay, so then we get into May, and it's draft time. Last year was held, I think, 8th, 9th, and 10th. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure if they're going to hold it in May this year or not. I think there's still a little bit of, it's still a little tenuous. But anyway, the NFL draft is held. After the draft, for players that aren't drafted, it is a fast and furious time when agents are trying to get their clients onto rosters. Again, it's a 90-man roster at that point, so there's a lot of spaces to fill. A lot of players are signed strictly because they got to have certain players to run reps. For example, you have what people refer to as a camp arm. That's a third or a fourth or a fifth quarterback that's signed by a team strictly because now you've got 10 wide receivers running routes. You've got running backs, 5 to 6 running backs running routes. You've got cornerbacks you got to run routes against. That's a lot of passes. So they're signing players in some respects just to get through camp, just to get through practices. So they'll have someone to kind of take the load off of their starting quarterback or their starting players in different positions. So that's a really crazy time, and a lot of details involved with that, and frankly kind of fascinating the way all that works. And then those who don't get onto rosters are looking at opportunities with the CFL, the Arena League, and any other league, I guess, that someone can find. Some players obviously have completed their degree. They're well prepared for life after college. Some, sadly, are quite desperate, and they never thought they wouldn't play in the NFL, and that makes it a really difficult time for them because it's kind of when everything comes home, and they realize it's not going to be a possibility for them. Or maybe they see that it's not a possibility for them, but it takes them sometimes years to really come to that conclusion and really come to grips with that, and that's hard. And I've had that conversation with a lot of players and a lot of parents, and there's a lot of tears involved. And I'm not trying to be overly melodramatic, but it is a hard time when anytime dreams die. So in June, agents with unsigned clients regroup. That's the kind euphemism to put it. Very often you're seeing relationships end in June because an agent a player saw an agent as his means to the NFL and as the gatekeeper and the guy that could make all his dreams come true and that could make miracles happen, and they don't happen. They certainly can't happen for everybody. So a lot of times there are hurt feelings and there's anger and there are those kinds of things, and relationships end, and maybe players start looking for other agents, and sometimes they can find them and sometimes they can't. But June is a hard time in the life of a lot of players and the life of a lot of agents. All right. So speaking of agents and their lifespan, about 250 to 300 sit in that class the last weekend in June, the last week of July, and they take the test Friday afternoon. Usually about 225 to 230, 240 pass, anywhere between 200 and 250, it's rounded. People take the test and then they give the test, I think, to agents, and they take the test, and then based on the results, they kind of find a meet in the middle, and they certify a certain number of agents. There's usually about a 20% attrition by agents after their first year alone, because there's so little understanding of what it is to be an agent and what the risks are and what the costs are and what it's like and how it is dealing with young people and dealing with their parents and dealing with the schools. It's a very high stress environment, obviously. So they get washed out pretty quickly. About 15% of first year agents actually get someone on a 90. Now, as we discussed, making it on a 90 doesn't make you any money. You have to get to 53 to make money. So a little more than 1 in 10 actually get a guy on a roster, and then about half of that actually get a guy on a practice squad or a 53. So it's tough that first year. Usually if you make it your second year, it improves. But again, there are no guarantees. And probably only a fourth to a tenth of the agent class ever gets to negotiate a free agent deal. That is the second deal. In other words, the one where you actually make money and really can kind of recoup your investment. All right, so let's talk about scouts. And I got to kind of hustle up a little bit on this part of it. Scouts come from all over the place, but usually they have some kind of in with the team. I think if you look at what I call the masthead, all the jobs filled with the San Diego Chargers, for example, about 3 or 4 of the people in personnel have the same last name as the owner. The Bengals, same way. The general manager, Mike Brown, I think is related to the family that owns the team. The Steelers are another team where they've had probably 2 or 3 Rooneys that have come through their scouting ranks. It's nice to, you got to choose your parents carefully, guys, is the old joke. I didn't get to do that. Maybe y'all can, and that's awesome if you are, but that's something you kind of have to run up against, and that's just part of the business, unfortunately. Now there is one actual attorney who was formerly an agent who's in the league as a scout. His name's Matt Groh, and he's with the Patriots. He's a scouting assistant right now or something like that that's in kind of in the main offices. Oops. Yeah. So he's not actually what you think of necessarily when you think of scouts, but he is doing the work and he's in personnel. Now, his last name happens to be Groh. His father was the head coach at UVA for a long time, and he was also an NFL head coach and an NFL assistant. And that was no small part of his getting a job, which kind of goes back to the first point I made. But there are lawyers that are in the business doing evaluation. So scouting, a lot of people don't understand, there's 2 kinds of scouting. One is pro, which is basically where you're watching the other 31 teams and kind of evaluating their players and deciding, well, that's a guy I'd like if they cut him, or that's a guy that might be a good fit for our system or whatever. And then there's college, which is kind of what you think of when you think of NFL scouts. The guys are going on the road and watching college players and maybe sitting in the stands or sitting in the press box and making notes and talking into their little recorders or whatever. And those are the guys that are filing reports, and those are the ones that are actually kind of deciding who's going to get drafted when the time comes. So that's pro and college. Most teams have 3 to 4 pro scouts and 7 to 9 college scouts. Now, some teams really go cheap, and they've only got like 2 or 3 college scouts. I think there's only one, the Bengals. Some teams have 10 to 12 guys on the road. I think the Browns hired that many this year. They just got a new general manager and kind of blew up their old way of doing things. So it varies, but those are generally the sizes of the department. I did a little research about a month ago, and found out that most of the scouts, I found 286 guys that are what I call road scouts. They're the college scouts. They're out there on the road visiting schools and rating players. Of the 286 I found, 198 have been on the job less than 10 years. I bet 120 of them have been on the job less than 5 years. The burnout factor is high, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But more so when teams feel like, oh my gosh, why are we spending all this money? We got to get rid of some people. The people that aren't, the bean counters tend to say, wow, what about these guys we're paying to just watch football? It's a little bit more complicated than that, obviously. But that tends to be where cuts are made. So that happens. There's not a whole lot of job security when it comes to being a scout. Most are given about a 3-year trial period before they're really considered for advancement and for bigger contracts and that kind of thing. You see a lot of people that don't make it 3, but there are a lot of them we'll kind of watch their careers and they'll get 3 years and then they're out. And the starting pay is usually around $50,000 to $60,000, which is quite a bump up from what it was even 5 to 6 years ago when they used to call entry-level scouts 20 guys. They were somewhere in their 20s and they're making somewhere in their 20s. That's not much money to make when you're spending 11 months on the road and you're rarely seeing your family and you're rarely having a social life and all those kinds of things. It's cool to march into a school and be wearing a team's colors, but when you check your bank account and it's pretty lean, then that makes it tough to do. Okay, so how do you become one? If any of y'all has the answer to this question, please let me know after class. Don't tell me now, because let's make some money together. I get people asking me this question all the time. What I tell them is that starting with a sports management degree as your undergrad is a nice start. You're seeing that a lot more and more, that you're seeing that degree a lot more and more in a lot of schools now. So it's something, but as I always say, I talked to a guy who is an NFL scout. He was with the Texans for a while, now he's, I think, with the Ravens. And he says, you know, there are a lot of people that sat there in sports management classes next to me and they thought they'd be the general manager of the Texans within 10 years, you know. And this guy went to Texas Tech, and he basically went in one day and said, hey, what can I do for you guys? And worked that up into a GA position, and then kind of did an assistant coach thing and made some connections, and then he got into scouting that way. And he told me something I thought was really funny. He said, you know, there are people that are making great grades in sports management programs when I was in. And those guys are, you know, a year out of college, are sitting by the phone hoping Dick's Sporting Goods will call them back so they can work as a sales associate, you know. If you're not out there busting your hump and trying to get real world experience, which is kind of one of the central themes of Succeed in Football, my blog, you're not increasing your chances for doing this. And then you really got to do that. That's kind of the vetting, is who's going to go out there and work and work and work and work for free and be told that you suck and be told, hey, what makes you think you can do this? You know, overcoming that is usually what the recipe for success in this industry, and I guess in just about every industry. So most scouts are hired through the network. The application process is tricky. Typically, application process is this, based on what I've seen. You go in, and usually most teams start looking around in the spring, usually around February, March, April. You apply, they may get 2,500 to 5,000 resumes. They're typically going to go through HR. HR is going to sift through and maybe take 100 out that the personnel department even sees. And then they look at those guys, and they're going to say, oh, that guy, he went to Arizona State. Well, you know, I know the quarterback's coach there. It says that he did some work there. Let me call him. Then the network kind of narrows it down to maybe 25 guys. And then they pick through it some more. And then they get maybe 10 guys, and they pick one of those 10, maybe two, to be a guy who works for free. So it's a really, really hard job just to get looked at by these people. It does happen, but it didn't happen for me. My little story was, I happened to call the Saints. Again, I'm a whodunit. And had a media background, and so I found out they had a media relations intern job open, and I knew someone who knew someone. And so I was able to get a call back, and they even brought me into an interview, which I thought, man, this is awesome. I'm gonna be general manager of the Saints in 10 years. And, but the position was, you get $800 a month stipend, that's it. The position was you travel on the road with the team, which would be awesome. But you're working all the time, and you're making $800 a month. So my deal was gonna be, I was gonna live in a house that some close friends and family had not been able to sell for like 5 years, which had no furniture in it, and was about an hour outside of New Orleans. And I didn't know what I was going to do to grovel for food and all that jazz. I guess I was going to go back to my parents' hat in hand and hope they'd send me money. And then I was going to try to make $800 last as long as I could, and beg, borrow, and steal what I could find. That story is not a lot different from most people that are getting into the business. You guys are going through law school. You guys are going to be professionals. You guys are obviously smart. You got stuff going on for you. It's hard to take a step back and go to that level and just basically start off at the very bottom and then hope that you can work your way up with no guarantees. So I certainly understand if that's something that is not appealing to you. It wouldn't be that appealing to me if I were in your situation either. All right, so a year in the life of a scout. And we're going to rush through this because we don't have a whole lot of time left. So May, we're going to start with the end of the draft. The draft wrapped up. The undrafted free agents are signed. The Blesto and National Combines had their event in May. Blesto and National are the two services that are kind of like the Mel Kiper Jr. for the NFL. They look, while everyone else is looking at seniors this year, the teams are, they're looking at juniors. They're looking at the players that will be seniors next year. And they charge a six-figure fee to the subscribing teams, and probably about 40% of the league does National, and probably 30% of the league does Blesto, and then there's another third that doesn't do either one. But anyway, in May, they come out and everyone comes and they meet and they present all the players, all the seniors, everyone that they think is going to be a high-end player. And it kind of gets NFL teams started, and they can kind of see who they want to look at, and they can map out what their scouts are going to do that fall. So in June, there's a lot of transition. That's where scouts' contracts may be running out. A new general manager comes in. He's going to build his own team. Usually that's going to be people he's worked with in the past that he trusts, that he's got contact with. So there are a lot of scouts that are getting put on the street then. Some will find work quickly. The lion's share won't. And it's really difficult because I've talked to so many scouts that have been in this situation, sometimes general managers. And when you've spent 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes in some cases, of your life basically watching football players, that doesn't easily translate to selling insurance or real estate or IT or anything else. These guys have to hope they can find something in coaching, and then that's usually tough too. And if not, then they're looking at a second career. Sometimes that's in their 50s. So that's a tough deal. And I'm not trying to paint things too darkly, but I do want to be real with y'all. So that's June. July, early July is kind of when the NFL stops. It really doesn't stop much anymore. It's almost like a year-round thing. But for the most part, the NFL stops in early to mid-July, and people take their vacations and do their family things. And then players report in late July, and things get started. And usually you're using your road scouts, your college scouts, to look at who you have in camp and evaluate them, as well as looking at other teams to see who you might be able to bring in and who you might want to bring in as they make cuts. So that's July. August is when the season starts, and that's, I'm speaking of the college season now. So they're going out and they're hitting schools and they're doing what scouts do. They're watching practices, they're talking to people, officials, trainers, teachers sometimes, obviously coaches, anyone they can gather information on about the top players that they're looking at within their region. Usually there are 6 regions of the country that scouts are kind of detailed to. You only do one region. That's August. September, a little bit, it kind of continues along that path. They're doing their road work and what have you. In November, they get back with the teams and they kind of start building their board. We get to December. That's when the College Bowl season begins. That's kind of final exam for players on the field at least. January, you have your All-Star games. That's a big deal. We talked about that a little bit. But that's a time when scouts can go see a lot of these players up close in one location. They can interview them. They can look at them. It's one last chance to see them on the field. February, the Combine, of course, at the end of the month. Teams are compiling their rankings. They're whittling things down. They're moving players around. March, Pro Days. We talked about Pro Days. That's a busy time of the year. April, they're holding on-site Pro Days for their players, and they're fine-tuning their rankings, and May is the draft. And that kind of wraps up their year. I kind of went through that quickly. That probably felt like more like 6 months, but we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure we get through everything. So common denominators, guys. Here's a few things I think that are takeaways. Obviously, there's a significant price to pay for both jobs if you want to be successful. For agents, a lot of it's money. You can spend $10,000, $20,000, $25,000 your first year with no guarantees, and that's hard. Now, you don't have to spend that amount, but a lot of people do, and it's not uncommon. For scouts, it's the vetting process. It's getting through and getting ahead of the people that are also applying and finding a way to give yourself an advantage. How you attain that, there are a lot of different ways. That's a little bit, I'd love to talk about that now, but we don't have time about it. Both are very volatile jobs that don't translate easily to other fields necessarily. I already told you about scouts I've talked to who are in desperate situations. They're kind of in the third quarter of their life. They would like to be retiring in about 10 years, but now they're having to look at a second career. So it's really tough. Like most jobs, in football, I should say, they seem very glamorous, but they're jobs. So they certainly have their ups and downs to them. And then last thing, and success is difficult, but it isn't impossible. And if y'all are seriously considering this, reach out to me, email me, reach out to me on Twitter, check me on the blog, whatever. I'm here to help, guys. I really, look, no one is successful in this industry, and I should have put this on here, without someone who helped them. God knows that that's been the case for me. Whatever success I've attained, and I'm certainly not saying I'm a superstar, it's because I had people that helped me. So that's kind of what we do. We charge $30 a month to help people, but that's not what I'm looking for right now.